Hello. In this lecture, I would like to speak a little bit about the ethical theory of utilitarianism. I'll begin by situating it sort of in comparison to several other major theories. Then I'll proceed to explain some of the basic principles, the basic tenets, the basic outlook of utilitarian ethics. And I'll conclude by offering a couple, difficulties with taking a utilitarian approach. So to begin with, just to recapitulate a topic from other videos, when we're looking for a theory of ethics, we're attempting to discover a way to articulate the good, the moral good. This sounds very straightforward and very simple, but any attempt to do it will immediately reveal the difficulty that's actually inherent in this kind of undertaking. We all have an intuitive sense for moral virtue, moral good, but we also, I think, again, if we attempt to express or provide a basis for why something is good compared to something else, we will again immediately be confronted with this difficulty of really bringing the principles, the underlying principles, bringing them to light. Now, this has been attempted through history in many different ways, and in the prior lecture, the lecture immediately prior to this one, I tried to lay out something of a survey of various notable attempts at this, articulating a coherent theory of ethics. I mentioned in that video that one of these attempts has gone under the rubric of utilitarianism. It was most cogently articulated by two thinkers in the 19th century. These were Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. They were both British thinkers, English thinkers. They articulated this theory in something of a juxtaposition against other major theories of ethics. I will just mention a couple of the most notable ones. One of them is called Deontological Ethics, and it's often associated with the name of Immanuel Kant. This is a kind of ethics that emphasizes the motive of a given action, and it's based on a sort of the moral worth of an action is evaluated according to the sense of duty by which it's carried out. We will speak more about Kantian ethics on another occasion. And I also, again, provided a brief and sketchy outline of it in the video prior to this one. But that's one ethical system that utilitarianism is contrasting itself with. Another one is probably most notably associated with the name of Aristotle. This, rather than centering on the motive or duty behind a given action, this virtue ethics emphasizes the character traits, or the type of actor, the type of agent, the character traits of an agent that performs a given action. So again, this was primarily developed by Aristotle, a student of Plato. And so again, utilitarianism is taking a totally different approach. And in some way, these are often considered the three primary or most dominant schools of ethical thinking today. I mentioned in the last video that part of this is because they are cogent and coherent and persuasive theories. That's part of it. But another part of the explanation for why these have become the dominant theories might have something to do with the fact that they're comparatively easy to articulate. They're comparatively easy to describe. And so, in some way, they lend themselves to being remembered in that sense. So it might be the case that other ways of conceptualizing ethics or conceptualizing what is the good might actually be more accurate. They might actually capture what we really experience and intuitively understand by the good. But nevertheless, they might be very difficult to describe. In any case, I will now proceed to try to outline the kind of basic tenets of utilitarianism. And again, among all of the ethical theories, utilitarianism might be the most straightforward, at least initially. And I say initially because, I will speak later about how some difficulties that are not immediately apparent will become apparent once we try to assume utilitarianism as our basis for action. But in a kind of superficial sense, it's very straightforwardly a question for the utilitarian. Rather than emphasizing character traits, like Aristotle, like virtue ethics, rather than emphasizing motive or duty or goodwill, like Immanuel Kant, like deontology, virtue ethics places the emphasis on consequence. So it's not agent-centered. It's not emphasizing the one who's performing the action. It's emphasizing the outcome of the action. So it's sometimes called a consequentialist ethic. And utilitarianism, that word, can sometimes be confusing. The idea of utility means something like use or benefit. When we think of something that's useful to us, it benefits us. Ordinarily, utility, in terms of utilitarian ethics, it's conceived of in terms of pleasure. In other words, so to state the basic axiom of utilitarian ethics, we might say that an action is moral insofar as it increases net pleasure, net happiness, net utility, so overall utility, for the greatest number of relevant stakeholders. Already one can sense the difficulty, which is how big is our community of stakeholders, right? But we'll get to that in a moment. I just want to, again, try to repeat this kind of overarching or fundamental, depending on how you picture this overarching or fundamental principle of utilitarian ethics, which is, does this contribute to net happiness, to net pleasure? Now, this clearly has its roots in an ancient Greek tradition called hedonism, or often associated with the name of Epicurus, so Epicureanism. And this is basically, Epicurus had a pleasure garden next to Plato's academy, or outside of the city of Athens. And their idea of the good life was the life of sensual enjoyment. And so there's a clear connection there's a clear historical development from Epicureanism to utilitarianism. Epicureanism has somewhat of it can have a derogatory connotation in the sense that Epicureanism can mean hedonism has clearly a derogatory connotation. It can mean something like just lust for pleasure or just pure appetite, right? Pure sensual appetite. Epicurean, an Epicurean would describe somebody who is constantly seeking sensual enjoyment. And it's not as though there's something wrong with this, but it's clearly, for example, in somebody from a different perspective of a different ethical framework might look at the utilitarian, or might look at the Epicurean as living a somewhat perhaps self-indulgent existence. John Stuart Mill especially attempted to somewhat distinguish utilitarianism from these associations, and so he immediately kind of set forth something like a hierarchy of pleasures. And so his idea was, not all pleasure is created equal. And he's kind of famous for this line. I don't know if it's the best line, but it's again, it lends itself to memory, and so of course it stuck in my head when I read it. The line is that, according to John Stuart Mill, from his point of view, he says that it's better to be a Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. And so his idea is actually there are something like higher pleasures. And for John Stuart Mill, the way he it can be difficult to say, well, who gets to decide what is a higher pleasure, right? Is Beethoven a higher pleasure than pizza, for example? And John Stuart Mill says he would probably say yes, and because he would say that, well, according to him, there is a sort of gradient or hierarchy of pleasures, and the idea is that if any person who is sufficiently familiar with both of them will always be able, there will be a consensus among people who are, if you're trying to decide between which of two pleasures is the highest. John Stuart Mill believes that there will be a consensus, and that two people will always agree that one of them is the higher pleasure. That's the way he sees it anyway, and clearly, well, probably not everyone would see it that way, but John Stuart Mill is quite a clear thinker. He makes a very convincing argument. We can see again the initial plausibility and in fact attractiveness of a theory like utilitarianism. It seems to make ethics quite objective. It's like you have some kind of clear criterion. It's not muddied by, for example, subjectivity, right? It's a clear question of what increases pleasure, and if you just you do a sort of calculation or calculus. In some sense, it appeals to our sense of kind of hard facts or data. We see this today in the corona crisis. It's somehow there's something reassuring about being able to kind of point to hard numbers, right, and calculations and models, etc. John Stuart Mill is clearly he's thinking in that same line with his when he's formulating utilitarian ethics. It's like, well, again, Europe. This is in the 19th century, but they've just been through recent centuries of religious conflicts between different religions, but also so inter and intra-religious conflicts. They've had wars between Protestants and Catholics that are extended over this century even. And so, again, it's quite appealing to John Stuart Mill to come up with something that's basically, from his point of view, it's something that is, again, objective, kind of factual, evidence-based sort of ethics. So I hope that has I hope that what I've said will have instilled a sense of familiarity with utilitarian ethics. That you have a feeling that you have a general idea of the gist of what John Stuart Mill, how he's approaching the elephant, so to speak, of ethics, his approach. Before I conclude this lecture, I would like to comment a little bit about some difficulties. I mentioned obvious attractive features of utilitarianism that make it attractive. I would like to say a few words, though, about some difficulties that maybe aren't immediately apparent, right? But again, they become apparent once we try to really make use of this theory. I'll just mention a couple, and so starting with the thing that I basically put forth most recently as a positive or attractive feature of utilitarian ethics, which is the notion that it's sort of evidence-based, or it deals with some kind of calculation, that you could calculate net happiness. Again, there's something quite attractive about it. It's reassuring to have hard numbers. At the same time, though, for the same reason, it's somewhat specious. And again, we also see this in the corona crisis. It's like we have all this data, but the facts don't speak for themselves. Facts don't speak, and we know that because these data that we have every day or from every source. It's always the reporter or the politician or the medical professional or whoever. It's always somebody else is doing the speaking. The facts themselves don't speak. The data doesn't. It's always somebody serving as their mouthpiece. And in fact, we realize that not even the mouthpiece. It's like, again, you need to. The data needs to be interpreted. We don't. Numbers by themselves are totally meaningless. And this is the utilitarianism will come up with the same kind of difficulty and kind of arbitrariness as we sometimes see with the corona numbers. It's like you can hear two totally conflicting, you can hear that it's getting better and it's getting worse at the same time, right? On the very same day that the situation seems to be improving and also deteriorating. And so it's clear that that it's not simply a straightforward situation of kind of putting numbers into an algorithm and getting an answer that's actually actionable, right? Again, I think despite the initial reassuring sense of having hard facts, the facts really they do much less for us than we might imagine. And so it's probably even worse. One thing I'll just say about to relate it back to the corona situation is that we see that different from the same facts, that two different people or two different sources, two different parties, they will make different things out of those same facts. And so again, I think despite the appearance of something like data-driven, something that relies on hard facts, despite the appearance of presenting something objective for people, it's actually far from the case in real life, in actual practice. In utilitarianism, might be even worse, and in other words, even more confusing, in the sense that it will be perhaps impossible to reach a true consensus among various stakeholders of what are the relevant facts. Let me just give a couple reasons for that. One of them I already mentioned, which is it's not clear how many people's pleasure, how many people's net happiness should be considered. It's not even clear if it should be limited to people, or should we consider the tulips or the rocks, like whether they're happy, or of course the birds and the creatures. How many beings do you include in your calculation? And obviously, clearly, the more beings that you include in your calculation, the more implausible it's going to become to actually perform that same calculation, which is ostensibly going to be the basis of your action in the first place. Almost an insurmountable difficulty that you encounter in that sense. Another obvious difficulty is what if some beings can feel infinitely more pleasure than others? They would totally outweigh any kind of, they would sort of tip the scales towards consideration of only their outcomes. Some philosophers have come up with a thought experiment, and it has quite a funny name. It's called the utility monster. And so they imagine a being that was somehow capable of this kind of like monstrous, unfathomable magnitude of happiness, and this would sort of outweigh everyone else's consideration. Now, the purpose of the thought experiment is to kind of reveal difficulties. It's really somewhat inconsequential of whether this utility monster actually exists. In fact, from the thought experiment doesn't suppose that it exists. It just, all it has to do is present a hypothetical case that kind of reveals lack of integrity in the system. So I guess with utilitarianism, it has a kind of intuitive appeal to us because of the notion of, well, it would be hard for somebody to disagree with the benefits of increasing net happiness, right? But at the same time, it might be the case that if we really care about this, that precisely for that, if we really care about net happiness, it might be for just that reason that we choose to align ourselves with a different theory other than utilitarianism. Much more could be said, of course, and I think that goes for just about every topic that we will cover. But I hope that with what I've said until now, if I've somewhat presented a picture of utilitarianism, I've presented at least some aspects, some attractive, some positive aspects, and then also some difficulties with utilitarianism. And so I hope that, again, this is probably a good place to stop, but I hope that this has been sufficient to give a sense of familiarity with this approach to ethics, and then there will be more to come. And of course, the more, well, everything that we encounter once, we also bring with us in further encounters. And so even studying other ethical theories will continue to shed light on utilitarianism through comparison and through contrast. So with that, I will conclude this video, and it's a pleasure to be able to speak to all of you, and farewell until next time.